The former President Donald Trump says that if he's elected president, he will make some sweeping tax changes, which include number one, cutting taxes for W-2 job earners. One of the things that really caught headlines here is he says that he wants to cut or eliminate taxes on tips, which would benefit bartenders and waiters. Number two is he says he wants to extend the tax cuts for big corporations. Number three, he says that he wants to raise taxes on things you buy from foreign countries. Now, I already did a whole deep dive on President Joe Biden's plan if he's elected again, on how he wants to change the tax law. If you have not seen that video yet, I'll link it for you down in the description. Now, just to run the same page, my goal with this video is not to talk about politics. There's plenty of people that do that. I'm going to be talking about money, finances, and taxes. That way you understand what's going on with your money. And I'm going to break this video up into three parts. First, I'm going to talk about Donald Trump's middle-class tax proposals. Number two is I'm going to talk about his tax proposals for corporations. And number three, I'm going to talk about his tax proposals on foreign countries. So let me start by talking about one, which is the middle class. There are two parts to this middle class tax proposal that I want you to understand. The first is extending the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, and number two is changing some of the tax laws. So let me start with talking about the Tax Cut and Jobs Act. But first, I want to remind you that on August 15th, 1971, the United States dollar was taken off of the gold standard. And because of that, on August 14th and 15th, 2024, I'm hosting a live, free, and virtual investor summit where I'm going to be going over, number one, how our money has changed over the last number of decades and over the last 5 years. And then number two, I'm going to talk about how investment and economic opportunities have been changing, especially recently. That way you know how to find new investment opportunities in today's changing economy with high inflation, higher interest rates, and now a slowing economy. So if you want to join me, this workshop is completely free. I got the link to how you can register down in the description below. The United States follows a marginal tax code system, which means the more money you make, the more money you pay in taxes. So if you make under $11,600, your top tax rate is 10%. If you make up to $47,100, your top tax rate is 12%. If you make up to $100,500 as a single income earner, your top tax rate is 22%. If you make up to $191,900, your top tax rate is 24%. $243,700, 32%. $609,300, 35%. And everything above that is 37%. This is what it looks like in 2024. And the reason why it looks like this, which might seem high or low, I guess it's up to you subjectively, but it's this rate, is because back when Donald Trump was president, he passed a tax reform called the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which cut taxes for pretty much all income earners. And this tax reform is set to expire next year, which means these tax rates are going to change. Let me show you. So if this tax reform actually expires, that means the tax rate that you might be paying could be going up. What that means is that the top tax rate for the bottom earners would stay at 10%. If it expires, that means for earners up to $47,100 will go up to 15%, not 12%. Here it will go up to 25%, not 22%. Here it would go up to 28%, not 24%. Here it would go up to 33%, not 32%. Here it would stay the same at 35%, which is currently 35%. And then the top tax rate would go up to 39.6% instead of the 37%. And just so you know, these numbers, the amount of money you need to make to fall into each bracket, they adjust every single year because of inflation, which is why I don't want you to really emphasize this, but really pay attention to these numbers right here. Now, what the Trump team has essentially said is that they don't want this to happen. They don't want it to lapse, that they want to extend this tax reform, which would keep the lower tax rate for pretty much everybody across the board, except for the really low income earners. But for everybody else, you would see a benefit. And I want to remind you that these are marginal tax brackets. What that means is if you're making $100,000 a year, that does not mean that you're paying 25% in taxes. What that means is for the first $11,600, you're paying 10% of your money in taxes. For then between $11,600 to $47,100, you're paying 12% of your money in taxes. And then for every dollar that you earn between $47,100 and then the $100,000, you're going to be paying the 22% of your money in taxes. So this is the top tax rate, and these are marginal tax brackets, which means as you make more money, well, then you pay more taxes on the more money that you earn. This is the first part to the Trump tax plan on the middle class. The second part to this is what Trump has said multiple times in interviews now, which is that he wants to eliminate taxes on people that are earning tips. So if you work in a restaurant, you're a bartender, you're a waiter, and you get paid in tips, what he says is that he wants to eliminate the taxes that you pay on that income. Now, again, none of this has actually been approved. These are just what he says. And what we see happen will actually depend on when that time comes. But I want you to understand what's going on. And the last thing that I want to discuss about middle class tax changes are potential increases to your standard deduction. Take a look. Other ideas that Trump's close economic advisors are discussing include an increase in the so-called standard deduction on year-end returns. So let me explain what that means, and I should remind you that if you have specific tax questions, talk to a tax advisor in your area. And although I am a licensed attorney, I'm not your attorney. So right now we have a standard deduction, and in 2024 that number is $14,600 if you are a single tax filer and $29,200 if you are a married tax filer. What that means is you do your taxes, and then whatever taxable income you have, you can just write off this amount of money. Because, well, that's what the standard deduction says. Now, if you have itemized deductions beyond this, then you can use your itemized deductions. But for the average American, they don't. So you just get to write off this amount of money from your income because that's what the standard deduction says. And this is where the Trump team has kind of hinted that they want to increase this number. How much? Well, we don't exactly know, but that's one of the things that they do as an additional way for you to potentially pay less money in taxes. This brings us to part 2, which is his proposals on corporations. Right now, the way that it works is corporations have a 21% tax rate, which means if this is a corporation and you make $10 million a year in revenue, and let's assume that half of this money is expenses, your payroll, your rent, and your other administrative expenses, which means you have $5 million in profit. Currently, this is taxed at 21%, which was again imposed through the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act that former President Trump passed when he was in office back in 2017. Again, if this tax proposal lapses, what that means is that corporate tax rates would then go up to 35%, but the Trump team has hinted that they want to extend this bill, this reform, which would keep corporate tax rates at the 21% number. Now, I do want you to understand a little bit more about how corporate tax rates work, because if a corporation is owned by this person right here, if you have $5 million of profit, what that means is the first thing you're going to do is you're going to pay 21% taxes on this $5 million. So there's $4 million or so left, a little bit under $4 million, but we'll just keep it at $4 million for now. Now, if you pull out this $4 million for yourself as the owner of this company, you don't get to just take out this $4 million for yourself, because now you have to pay taxes yourself. So if you take this $4 million out on you, now you're gonna have to pay taxes on the $4 million. And those are the marginal tax rates that I just showed you on the whiteboard a second ago. So understand that with corporations, it's called a double layered tax. The corporation has to pay taxes, and then the owner has to pay taxes. So corporations are kind of treated like a separate person, and that's what this tax rate is. So right now, if this tax proposal lapses at the end of next year, that means that the corporate tax rate would go up to 35%. But according to the Trump team, if Trump wins, then they want to bring it back down to 21% by extending this tax reform. And the second, more unique part to this is potentially cutting payroll taxes. Reuters says that among the ideas that advisors have presented to the former president is a cut to the federal payroll tax. So let me explain. Let's assume that this is you and you work for this corporation. We have a guy with a mustache in Punjabi, my native language. We call a mustache a much. And we have a lady with a braid in my native language, Punjabi. We call a braid a gut. So you work for this corporation, and let's assume that you're making $100,000 a year. You don't get to actually keep all $100,000, not just because you have to pay income taxes, but you also have to pay payroll taxes, FICA taxes. What that means for you is that you're going to have to pay 6.2% of this money in Social Security taxes, and then an additional 1.45% of this money in Medicare taxes. That's money that you're paying right out of your paycheck directly. But that's not all. Your boss, your employer, also has to pay their share of your payroll taxes, because that means your corporation also has to pay 6.2% of this money in Social Security taxes, and they also have to pay an additional 1.45% of this money in Medicare taxes. This is how payroll taxes work, that the corporation pays and then you pay. You pay half and half, and if you're self-employed, that means you got to pay both. It means you got to pay both of these directly out of your paycheck. Now, what President Trump is proposing is to reduce some of these payroll taxes. To what extent, we're not exactly sure, but some people are worried that that could mean less money going into Social Security, less money going into Medicare, but that could mean more money going into your hands. Good or bad, I'll leave that up to you to decide, but that's one of the things that he's proposing. We don't know exactly what it would look like. We know that when the pandemic was happening, one of the things that he proposed was to completely cut the payroll taxes, but they didn't do that. They ended up just deferring the payroll taxes. So we'll see what this looks like if he actually is elected, and then they put together a proposal. And this brings me to the third part of this video, which are taxes on foreign imports. The Trump team wants to impose a 10% or higher universal baseline tariff on all imports and lift current tariffs on China to at least 60%. So this is what the Trump team means when they say that they want foreign countries to pay their fair share, that if other countries are shipping their products to us, that there's going to be a tax charged on that, probably to encourage people to buy more American-made goods. So now that you've heard the three major changes to middle-class earners, to corporations, and to foreign countries, what do you think? Is this good? Is this bad? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. Let's start by jumping in to the individual tax change proposals that President Biden is making. President Biden wants the IRS to go after people who have not paid their taxes. President Biden has already secured additional funding for the IRS that is enabling it to crack down on the high-income individuals and corporations who too often avoided paying their lawfully owed taxes.